The forest was alive with life hidden from ordinary eyes. Nature spirits moved eagerly among the trees. Some watched her with curiosity. For a moment, she thought she could see the trees breathe. Behind an old moss-covered tree trunk, as wide as a small house, something extraordinary caught her eye. It looked like the shape of a woman in a long, luminous dress shifting between silver and gold. No face, only light. It appeared as though her hair was just threads of bright light moving very slowly in the air, as if gravity had little effect on it. The being was too bright to look at for more than a few seconds. Scylla turned away for a moment to rest her eyes. When she looked again, there was no sign of the luminous being. Scylla was enthralled by the encounter, but suddenly the sound of a splash brought her attention back to the river. As she glanced into the water, she saw what appeared to be water nymphs, moving playfully, colorful, elegant, and nimble. One of them splashed in the water again, as if to get her attention. It looked at her, then pointed towards the path she was on that led to the river. Scylla laughed and said, "Yes, I would like to cross the river. Could you—" She paused and took up her book of known beings and creatures of the Starlight Forest. It had a green leather cover with a dark blue gemstone on the back. Scylla touched the gemstone. Her magic activated it with a dark shine. Holding the book with both her hands, she aimed the gemstone towards the water nymph. The book shook slightly, then opened. Scylla read the page on which it had opened. "As I thought, you are a water nymph. Let's see." She read for a moment while the impatient splashing of water continued. "Friendly and known to help travelers. This is good news. Now, what do you want to show me?" She walked over to where the edge of the path led into the river. Looking closer, Scylla could see something glowing deep in the water. She carefully lifted her left foot and held it over the water as if to take a step. A small rock appeared from beneath the water, then another and another, making a small walking path that was perfectly dry and perfectly sized for her feet. As she carefully walked across, she thought that this must be another border. She was curious to understand how it worked, but she knew she had to keep moving. Perhaps she could take a longer look on the way back. Why no maps work. Scylla had not walked more than an hour after crossing the river when she noticed the air was different. She could feel it in her lungs, even on her skin. It almost felt as though she weighed less. Walking in the forest for a while, breathing in an aroma she could not identify, had some strange effect. It was everywhere, but it also shifted in nature and intensity from time to time. But that was not the only reason she was fascinated. There was also a sense of space. The forest was vast. The trees were breathtaking, some taller than any trees she had come across or even heard of. They were wide and covered with moss in many different shades of green, from the ground up to the branches. Some had small flowers growing on them. Scylla saw small creatures running on a branch far up above her head. She could hear distant laughter echoing through what felt like an endless world. She knew that the trees were home to wisps, forest spirits, and even the small folk. Her eyes were constantly searching to see them and their legendary dwellings, said to be at the foot of big tree trunks covered with moss, flowers, and small hanging lamps. But the forest seemed very still now, and at the same time alive, breathing, moving, shifting, and unfolding in every moment. Scylla could hear bird song and a stream echoing in her ears. She couldn't tell from how far away the sounds were traveling. "This is almost unreal." She thought back to the conversation she had had with Liliana and Ulf about mapping the forest earlier that day. With their discussion in mind, she began to look around in her vicinity. "The first landmark should be the river. specifically the bridge. I have to remember to explain to Liliana how it works, she thought. Farther into the forest, she saw a small hill with a massive tree on top of it. Curious to test Ulf's idea, she walked off the path towards it. She reached it and considered how she could climb it. She had always been athletic, but her cautious nature made her plan before acting. She grabbed a branch and pulled herself up, then placed her feet on another branch. She moved from one branch to another at a steady pace until she was high enough to get a clear view past the foliage of the nearby trees. She gazed northwest towards the Dragon Mountains. They had been clearly visible in the distance before entering the forest, but now all she could see was the starlight forest continuing as far as her eyes could see. Puzzled and intrigued, she returned to the path and sat down on the ground. Maybe Ulf was right, but how? She asked out loud, as if hoping the forest would answer her. He said something about the size did not align within the forest compared to the outside. She knew that archmages could use dimensional storage. For example, a small sack could contain far more than its size suggested was possible, or a small house could be far more spacious inside than outside. This was either dimensional magic or just teleportation magic where you moved to a new location. How the entire forest could be anything similar is beyond comprehension. Lost in thought, she grabbed her journal to note down these observations before continuing her journey. Spirits of the Forest. A few hours had passed since Scylla had begun her journey. The scenery still amazed her, and as she got farther in, more of its inhabitants showed themselves. A majestic stag watched her from a distance, while wisps of different colors flew among the trees. The sound of someone talking suddenly caught her attention. She walked up to a nearby stump where the voices came from, and saw some small creatures on it. Crouching down, she found a group of small folk, 4 of them standing on the remains of a once great tree. There were 3 boys and 1 girl, dressed in brown and green attire. 2 of the boys wore caps. Their ears were long and pointy, attached backward along their heads. They were about as tall as the length of Scylla's hands. They talked and pointed up towards something, seemingly oblivious of Scylla's approach. She looked up too. A few meters up on a branch, a small folk girl was carrying nuts. They appeared almost too heavy for her as she wobbled along the branch. Stepping carefully, the girl was near the stem of the tree when a red squirrel suddenly appeared. The little girl screamed and lost her balance. The squirrel seemed to attempt to catch the girl, and Scylla could have sworn she saw a look of guilt in its eyes. As the girl lost her footing and fell, she suddenly slowed down until she was gently floating near the tree stump. The other small folk were jumping and shouting in a language Scylla had never heard before. She knew there must be more than the eye could see, so she cast the spell of true sight again. A surge of energy passed through her eyes, and she could see what was hidden in the world. Gently carrying the small folk girl towards the ground was a humanoid form with no clear features, as if it consisted of pure light. Its long hair flowed in the air. As it released the small folk girl back to her friends, it turned its head toward Scylla. She realized this was a similar being to the one she had seen earlier. Slowly she lifted her book with the enchanted gem. "Hello, this book will just let me know who I'm talking to. It is completely harmless," she said, turning the dark blue gem toward the being and activating it. Its head seemed to tilt to the side curiously as she spoke. The book reacted, and she turned it towards her as it opened. Scylla read out loud, "You are an Elua, a pure good being. I could tell by the way you saved that small girl." The Elua moved up near a tree and watched her as she read. "Invisible by day, but becomes visible by night. Unless you know magic, Scylla added and gave it a wink. Interesting. Ailuas don't eat physical food, but feed off the taste and energy of food. She closed the book and examined the Ailua. It felt as though it was looking back at her, even though she could not see its eyes. The Ailua took a step outward from the tree facing Scylla, raised its luminous hand and waved before turning around and walking deeper into the forest. As Scylla followed it with her gaze, she could see more Ailuas further in the forest. I cannot really tell if you're walking or floating. She put the book away and took up her notebook to make a sketch of what she had seen. To transcribe and draw magical beings had always been one of her biggest interests. One of her dreams was to find unknown beings nobody had ever seen before. As she was sitting on the ground, she saw the small folk make their way off the stump. One of them waved at her. So they can see me. Be careful out there, little ones. The last of them jumped off the stump, and she could no longer see them. She grabbed some dried apple from her bag and took a bite. It was completely tasteless. She could see more Ailuas further in the forest. She chuckled and said out loud, You're welcome, but next time we should trade something.